Tokyo, January 1942. Inside the fortified walls of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters, Rear Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu placed a leather-bound intelligence report on the polished conference table. The document, stamped with red classifications, marks across its cover, bore a title that would soon prove catastrophically wrong: Projected Timeline for American Submarine Threat Development in the Pacific Theater. The room fell silent as senior officers leaned forward. What they read offered comfort in a time of expanding war. According to the Navy's best analysts, American submarines posed minimal immediate danger. The report estimated it would take the United States Navy at least 4 to 5 years to develop an effective submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping, 4 to 5 years to train adequate crews, 4 to 5 years to establish forward bases across the vast Pacific, 4 to 5 years to solve the technical problems plaguing their torpedo systems. The assembled admirals nodded in agreement. Japan had time to fortify the empire's defensive perimeter, time to extract resources from conquered territories, time to build the aircraft and warships needed to defend against the inevitable American counteroffensive. The submarine threat could wait. They were wrong. Catastrophically, terribly wrong. Within 36 months, not the projected 48 to 60 months, American submarines would sink over 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, not in 4 years, but in 3. Not gradually, but with accelerating ferocity that would strangle Japan's war economy, isolate its island garrisons, and create a maritime nightmare that would haunt Japanese sailors for generations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of the Japanese estimate seemed reasonable in January 1942. The United States Pacific Submarine Force consisted of 55 fleet submarines and 18 obsolete S-class boats. Total operational strength: 73 submarines scattered across an ocean spanning 63 million square miles. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated over 6 million tons of merchant shipping, supported by hundreds of warships. How could such a small American force threaten an empire? Japanese naval doctrine, developed during the 1920s and 1930s, assumed submarines would target battleships and aircraft carriers in decisive fleet engagements. The concept of unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant vessels violated traditional naval thinking. Japan's own submarines, technologically advanced and equipped with the excellent Type 95 torpedo, focused exclusively on enemy warships. Japanese planners assumed American submarines would follow similar doctrine. This assumption ignored history. It ignored the lessons of German U-boat campaigns in World War I. It ignored the vulnerability of island empires dependent on seaborne logistics. Most critically, it ignored American determination to wage total war after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Thomas Hart commanded the United States Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines when war began. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, he received authorization from Washington that would define the Pacific Submarine War. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no restrictions. Every Japanese merchant vessel, from massive tankers to small coastal freighters, became legitimate targets. The order represented a fundamental shift in American naval strategy. The United States had condemned unrestricted submarine warfare when Germany employed it in World War I. Now, facing an enemy that had attacked without warning, American policy embraced the same ruthless approach. Every Japanese ship on the ocean was now prey. But authorization to hunt and the capability to kill were different things. The American submarine force faced a crisis that Japanese intelligence had correctly identified but incorrectly assessed. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard armament for American submarines, was fundamentally, catastrophically defective. 3 separate failures plagued the weapon. The magnetic influence exploder designed to detonate beneath a target's keel frequently triggered prematurely or not at all. The depth control mechanism ran 11 feet deeper than set, causing torpedoes to pass harmlessly beneath shallow draft vessels. Most devastating, the contact exploder crumpled on impact instead of detonating when torpedoes struck armored hulls at perpendicular angles. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout experienced this nightmare on December 8, 1941, just hours after war began. He maneuvered Trout into perfect attack position against a Japanese transport anchored in Apari Harbor, Philippines. Range 1,500 yards. Solution: perfect. Ramage fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes. All 4 hit the stationary target with solid metallic clangs audible through Trout's hull. None exploded. The torpedoes bounced off the transport's hull plates and sank to the harbor bottom. Ramage watched through his periscope as the undamaged ship weighed anchor and sailed away. He surfaced that night and radioed a message to Admiral Hart that captured the fury and frustration every submarine commander would soon share. Torpedoes hit target. Torpedoes did not explode. Require immediate investigation of torpedo reliability. The message reached Pearl Harbor, where it joined dozens of similar reports flooding in from submarine commanders across the Pacific. USS Sago fired 13 torpedoes at anchored Japanese vessels in Cambran Bay. None exploded properly. USS Skipjack fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese tanker convoy. 2 detonated prematurely, alerting the escorts. The rest failed to explode on contact. USS Sculpin fired 9 torpedoes at the Japanese aircraft carrier Ryukaku from point-blank range. Not one detonated. The carrier escaped undamaged, while Sculpin endured a punishing depth charge attack. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring these early attacks drew exactly the wrong conclusion. American torpedoes were unreliable. They reported to Tokyo. American submarine commanders were poorly trained. The submarine threat remained minimal. This assessment seemed validated by the numbers. During the first 6 months of 1942, American submarines sank approximately 90 Japanese merchant ships totaling roughly 300,000 tons. Serious losses, but manageable. Japanese shipyards launched new construction faster than submarines could sink existing vessels. The Empire's merchant fleet actually grew during early 1942 as new ships joined the fleet. What Japanese analysts failed to recognize was that American submarine commanders were not poorly trained. They were handicapped by defective weapons and, in some cases, by peacetime leadership that proved inadequate for total war. The weapons problem would be solved through the desperate initiative of commanders who disobeyed orders and conducted unauthorized testing. The leadership problem would be solved more brutally by relieving cautious skippers and replacing them with aggressive hunters willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Charles Lockwood assumed command of the Pacific Submarine Force in February 1943. A submariner since 1914, Lockwood understood that his boats were being crippled by defective torpedoes and that the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport refused to acknowledge any problems. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the Mark 14 performed exactly as designed. Submarine commanders, the Bureau suggested, were making excuses for their own tactical failures. Lockwood decided to prove the Bureau wrong. He ordered USS Muskellunge to conduct unauthorized tests, firing torpedoes at fishing nets suspended at known depths in Hawaiian waters. The results were undeniable. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth passed through nets at 21 feet depth. Every torpedo ran 11 feet deeper than set. Lockwood sent the test results to Washington with a direct challenge. Fix the depth mechanism, or relieve me of command. The Bureau of Ordnance reluctantly authorized adjustments to the depth mechanism. One problem solved, two remained. The magnetic influence exploder continued, causing premature detonations or complete failures. Lockwood ordered all submarines to deactivate the magnetic exploder and rely solely on contact detonation. The Bureau of Ordnance protested violently, but Lockwood refused to back down. Submarines would use contact exploders only. Results improved immediately, but not enough. Torpedoes were hitting targets and still not exploding. Commander Lawson Ramage, now skipper of USS Pash, conducted his own, unauthorized test. He fired a torpedo at the sheer cliff faces along the Hawaiian coast, calculating that the rocky cliff would provide an unyielding target similar to heavy armor plate. The torpedo struck the cliff face at a perpendicular angle and bounced off without detonating. It tumbled backward into deep water, where water pressure finally triggered the exploder. Ramage had proven the contact exploder failed when striking heavy resistance at 90-degree angles. The firing pin mechanism crumpled instead of triggering detonation. By summer 1943, all three defects had been identified and corrected. Torpedoes now ran at correct depth. Magnetic exploders were deactivated. Contact exploders were redesigned to function reliably. American submarines finally possessed a weapon that worked. The Imperial Japanese Navy was about to discover what happened when aggressive submarine commanders, equipped with reliable torpedoes, hunted merchant convoys with unrestricted rules of engagement. The catastrophe Japanese analysts had predicted would take 4 to 5 years to develop was about to arrive in 18 months. Captain Tamechi Hara commanded the destroyer Shigure, one of Japan's most successful warships. In August 1943, he received orders to escort a troop convoy from Shanghai to the Philippines. Standard assignment, routine convoy duty. Hara noted in his private log that convoy escort had become increasingly dangerous work. American submarines were becoming more aggressive, more skillful, and significantly more deadly. During his previous convoy escort mission in June, 2 transports had been torpedoed and sunk within 30 minutes. Shigure had dropped over 60 depth charges without detecting the attacking submarine. The Americans had simply vanished after firing their torpedoes. Hara's convoy departed Shanghai on August 14, 1943. 6 transport ships carrying 4,000 soldiers, escorted by Shigure, 3 smaller escort vessels. Japanese doctrine called for convoys to sail at night when submarines operating on the surface could be detected visually. During daylight hours, convoys zigzagged unpredictably to complicate submarine attack solutions. These tactics had worked reasonably well against the cautious American submarine commanders of 1942. They proved inadequate against the aggressive skippers of 1943, who possessed working torpedoes and increasingly sophisticated radar systems. On the night of August 17th, USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley Morton, detected Hara's convoy using surface search radar from 20,000 yards, well beyond visual range. Morton had become legendary among American submariners for his aggressive tactics and his partnership with Executive Officer Richard O'Kane, who would later become the most successful submarine commander in American history. Morton's approach to submarine warfare was simple and brutal. Get close, shoot straight, sink everything. Wahoo tracked the convoy for 2 hours, using radar to maintain contact while remaining invisible in the darkness. Morton planned his attack with precision. He would surface, close to point-blank range under cover of darkness, fire a full spread of torpedoes, then crash dive before the escorts could respond. At 2300 hours, Morton brought Wahoo to the surface 4,000 yards from the convoy's port side. The transport ships appeared as dark shapes against the slightly lighter horizon. Morton closed to 1,800 yards. From the bridge, he could see the transports clearly now, massive silhouettes moving at 12 knots through calm seas. "Fire," Morton ordered. Wahoo's forward torpedo tubes launched 6 Mark 14 torpedoes in rapid succession. Morton counted aloud, timing the torpedo run. 45 seconds. The first torpedo struck the lead transport amidships. The explosion lit the night sky. Before the sound of the first detonation faded, the second torpedo hit the same transport near the stern. The ship broke in half. 2 more torpedoes struck the second transport, which immediately began listing heavily to port. The 5th and 6th torpedoes missed, passing through the convoy as ships began emergency turns. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" Morton shouted. Wahoo's crew scrambled below. The submarine's dive alarm sounded. Within 30 seconds, Wahoo had submerged to 150 feet and was speeding away from the convoy at flank speed. Above them, they heard the distinctive sound of destroyer screws. Shigure was hunting. Captain Hara had reacted instantly when the torpedoes struck. He turned Shigure toward the area where torpedo wakes had originated and increased speed to 30 knots. He ordered depth charges prepared and sonar operators to sweep the water ahead. But Wahoo was already gone, running deep and fast at a right angle to Shigure's approach. Hara dropped 18 depth charges in the area where he estimated the submarine had dived. None came close to Wahoo. The American submarine escaped without damage, while behind Shigure, 2 transport ships sank, carrying 1,400 Japanese soldiers to the bottom. The survivors, floating in oil-covered water, would wait 5 hours before the remaining escorts could break off the futile submarine hunt and conduct rescue operations. Only 600 soldiers were recovered alive. 800 drowned or died from exposure. Captain Hara filed his action report 3 days later when the convoy reached Manila. His conclusions were stark and would prove prophetic. The Americans have developed surface radar that allows them to detect and track our convoys at night from beyond visual range. They approach on the surface, fire accurately from close range, then dive and escape before we can counterattack. Our escorts lack comparable radar. We cannot detect submarines approaching on the surface at night. Our sonar cannot track submarines moving at high speed during evasion. Our depth charges cannot reach submarines operating at 300 feet or deeper. We are essentially helpless against these tactics. Hara's report reached the Imperial Navy General Staff in Tokyo, where it joined dozens of similar reports from convoy commanders across the Pacific. The pattern was clear and terrifying. American submarines were operating with a level of coordination, intelligence, and technical capability that exceeded all Japanese projections. They were not fumbling novices requiring years of experience. They were professional killers equipped with working weapons and advanced technology. Japanese naval intelligence attempted to understand how American submarines consistently positioned themselves along convoy routes. Some analysts suggested American reconnaissance aircraft were spotting convoys and radioing positions to submarines. This theory failed to explain how submarines appeared at night along routes that had been classified as secret. Other analysts proposed that American submarines were simply patrolling probable shipping lanes and getting lucky. This theory failed to explain the statistical improbability of submarines repeatedly appearing at exactly the right time and place to intercept convoys. The truth was worse than Japanese intelligence imagined. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes in 1942 through an operation designated Magic. By 1943, American intelligence was reading Japanese convoy routing messages, sometimes before the convoy commanders themselves received them. Additionally, American codebreakers had cracked IJN 40, the Japanese Merchant Shipping Code, providing detailed information about cargo, troop numbers, and exact schedules. This intelligence reached submarine headquarters at Pearl Harbor, where Admiral Lockwood's staff analyzed convoy patterns and positioned submarines along predicted routes. American submarines were not hunting blindly across the vast Pacific. They were waiting at specific coordinates at specific times because American intelligence had told them exactly where Japanese convoys would be. It was not warfare in any traditional sense. It was coordinated assassination arranged by appointment. By autumn 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer deny the catastrophic reality unfolding across the Pacific. The submarine threat that intelligence analysts had confidently predicted would require 4 to 5 years to mature had arrived in full force after just 22 months of war. The numbers told a story of accelerating destruction that defied every Japanese projection. September 1943 saw American submarines sink 43 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 172,000 tons. October brought 51 ships sunk, 208,000 tons destroyed. November added another 48 ships and 194,000 tons to the Clyde toll. The merchant fleet that Japanese planners had assumed would remain largely intact until at least 1945 was hemorrhaging vessels at a rate that made replacement impossible. Japanese shipyards worked frantically to build new merchant vessels, but construction rates could not match destruction rates. Japan possessed approximately 20 major shipyards capable of building ocean-going merchant vessels. Maximum combined output under optimal conditions was roughly 600,000 tons per year. American submarines were now sinking merchant tonnage at a rate exceeding 700,000 tons annually and accelerating. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Japan was losing the logistics war it never expected to fight. More devastating than the raw tonnage figures was the human cost accumulating with each sinking. Transport ships carried not just cargo but thousands of Japanese soldiers desperately needed to defend the empire's contracting perimeter. When submarines torpedoed these transports, the soldiers drowned by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands, trapped in flooding compartments as ships capsized and sank within minutes. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 48th Division boarded transport ship Kyoko Maru in Shanghai on November 3, 1943. His division had been ordered to reinforce the garrison at Rabaul, where American and Australian forces were tightening their grip on Japanese positions. Tanaka was 26 years old, a veteran of fighting in China, recently promoted for bravery during defensive operations along the Yangtze River. He kept a diary throughout his military service, a violation of regulations but a practice common among educated officers. His final entry was dated November 8, 1943. "We are 3 days from Rabaul. The seas are rough. Many men are seasick. I spend my time on deck, watching the horizon. The merchant sailors tell us stories of American submarines. They say the submarines appear without warning, fire their torpedoes, and vanish before the escorts can respond. The sailors seem frightened. They smoke constantly and watch the water as though expecting death to rise from the depths at any moment. I try to maintain confidence for my men, but I confess to this diary that I feel uneasy. We are helpless passengers on this ship. If the Americans attack, we can do nothing but drown." Tanaka's diary was recovered in 1978, when a fisherman found a watertight document case floating off the coast of New Britain. Kyoko Maru had been torpedoed by USS Guardfish on November 9, 1943. The transport sank in 4 minutes. Of the 2,300 soldiers aboard, fewer than 400 survived. Lieutenant Tanaka was not among them. His body was never recovered. His name appears on the memorial wall in Tokyo, among the 60,000 merchant marine casualties, though he died as an army officer. The distinction between soldier and sailor blurred when submarines attacked. Everyone drowned together in the darkness. The psychological impact of these disasters rippled through the Japanese military with effects that went far beyond simple casualty statistics. Soldiers ordered to board transports for deployment to distant garrisons began requesting transfers to any assignment that did not involve ocean voyages. Officers who had eagerly sought combat postings now used family connections to secure positions in home islands' garrisons. The warrior culture that had driven Japanese military expansion since the Meiji Restoration confronted a new kind of fear, the helpless terror of drowning in a sinking ship while an invisible enemy escaped untouched. This was not honorable death in combat. This was slaughter without the possibility of resistance or revenge. Japanese merchant marine officers experienced even more profound demoralization. Captain Ichiro Fujimoto commanded cargo ship Tamon Maru on 6 successful voyages between Japan and the Dutch East Indies during 1942 and early 1943. He was an experienced officer who had sailed commercial routes throughout Asia for 15 years before the war. In April 1943, he filed a formal request with the shipping ministry to be reassigned to coastal duties within Japanese home waters. His request was denied. Tamon Maru was one of the few remaining medium-speed cargo vessels capable of making the critical oil runs from Dutch East Indies refineries to Japanese ports. Fujimoto's expertise made him irreplaceable. On his 7th voyage to the Dutch East Indies, Fujimoto's ship joined convoy HI-43, departing Singapore on June 2, 1943. The convoy included 8 tankers and cargo ships, escorted by 3 destroyers and 4 submarine chasers. Japanese convoy doctrine called for ships to maintain strict radio silence, sail in multiple columns, with escorts on the flanks, and execute emergency turns if torpedoes were spotted. These tactics had evolved through painful experience, but they remained inadequate against submarines equipped with radar and armed with reliable torpedoes. USS Harder, under Commander Samuel Dealey, detected convoy HI-43 on June 5 using surface search radar. Dealey was among the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Pacific Fleet, a Texan who had grown up hunting and brought the same relentless pursuit instinct to submarine warfare. He tracked the convoy for 6 hours, noting its speed, course, and composition. Then he radioed his contact report to Pearl Harbor and to USS Pargo, operating 200 miles to the north. Pargo's commander, David White, altered course to intercept. 2 submarines would attack the convoy in coordination, a tactic American submariners called Wolfpack operations. Captain Fujimoto stood on Tamon Maru's bridge during the evening watch on June 5, scanning the darkening horizon with binoculars. The convoy had sailed through dangerous waters without incident for 3 days. Perhaps this voyage would succeed. Perhaps the Americans would not find them. Then, at 21:15 hours, the lead destroyer fired a green flare, the signal for emergency turn. Fujimoto ordered hard right rudder. Tamon Maru heeled into the turn. Other ships in the convoy executed the same maneuver, creating chaos in the formation as vessels turned simultaneously. Harder fired 6 torpedoes into the turning convoy from a range of 1,200 yards. 3 torpedoes struck tanker Sango Maru, which exploded in a massive fireball that illuminated the entire convoy. 2 more torpedoes hit cargo ship Katori Maru, which capsized within 90 seconds. The 6th torpedo struck destroyer Isanami, breaking the warship's back. The destroyer sank in 3 minutes with all hands. While the convoy escorts raced toward Harder's firing position, Pargo attacked from the opposite flank. Commander White fired 4 torpedoes at Tamon Maru. 2 hit. Fujimoto felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. The explosion threw him against the chart table. Emergency lighting failed. In darkness, he heard water rushing into the hull and the screaming of injured crewmen. The ship began listing immediately to starboard. Fujimoto knew his vessel was doomed. "Abandon ship," he ordered. But there was no time. Taemon Maru rolled completely onto its side 45 seconds after the torpedo struck. Fujimoto found himself in the water, swimming away from the capsizing hull. Behind him, he heard men trapped inside the ship, pounding on steel plates, screaming for help that would never come. The ship sank stern first. The suction pulled swimmers underwater. Fujimoto swam desperately, fighting the current. He surfaced, gasping, and watched his ship disappear. Of Taemon Maru's crew of 68, 15 survived the sinking. Fujimoto was among them. He floated in oil-covered water for 11 hours before being rescued by submarine chaser CH-27. The shipping ministry assigned him to harbour master duties at Osaka, where he processed casualty reports from submarine attacks for the remainder of the war. Convoy HI-43 lost 5 ships in less than 30 minutes. The surviving vessels scattered and fled at maximum speed. The escorts dropped depth charges randomly, hoping for lucky hits against submarines that had already withdrawn to safe distances. Not a single depth charge came within damaging range of either American submarine. Harder and Pargo rendezvoused 2 days later to compare notes. They had coordinated perfectly, attacking simultaneously from opposite sides of the convoy to divide the escort's attention. The tactic worked exactly as planned. Japanese convoy commanders now faced not just individual submarines, but coordinated attacks by multiple boats operating as hunting packs. By December 1943, exactly 24 months after Pearl Harbor, American submarines had sunk over 600 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling approximately 2.4 million tons. Japanese shipbuilding during the same period had added roughly 900,000 tons of new construction. The net loss exceeded 1.5 million tons. Japan's merchant fleet, which had begun the war at 6.4 million tons, had shrunk to approximately 4.9 million tons. The empire required at least 5.9 million tons of operational shipping to maintain the war economy and supply distant garrisons. The gap between requirement and availability was widening catastrophically. Japanese industry began experiencing resource shortages that crippled production. Rubber from Southeast Asia could not reach tire factories because the tankers that would have carried it lay on the ocean floor. Tin from Malaya accumulated in warehouses because freighters were too scarce and too vulnerable to risk the voyage to Japan. Most critically, oil from the Dutch East Indies, the resource that had motivated Japan's entire southern expansion, could not be transported to refineries in sufficient quantities. Japanese tanker losses in 1943 exceeded replacements by a ratio of 3-to-1. Every tanker sunk represented not just the vessel, but the fuel it would have carried across dozens of future voyages. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with the third largest fleet in the world, found itself increasingly unable to operate because fuel oil could not reach fleet anchorages. Training exercises were cancelled to conserve fuel. Carrier aircraft sat grounded because aviation gasoline was being rationed. Destroyer squadrons remained in port because steaming at sea consumed precious fuel oil that could not be replaced. The fleet that Japanese admirals had planned to unleash in decisive battle against American carriers was being strangled by logistics failure before it could engage the enemy. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, presented a classified briefing to Emperor Hirohito in January 1944. The briefing included charts showing merchant ship losses, fuel consumption rates, and projected shipping capacity through 1945. The mathematics were undeniable. If current loss rates continued, Japan would lack sufficient merchant tonnage to sustain the war effort by autumn 1944. Fuel reserves would be exhausted by early 1945. The Emperor asked a single question that pierced through all strategic planning. Can we stop the submarines? Nagano answered with painful honesty. No, Your Majesty. We lack the technology, the resources, and the escorts to defend our merchant fleet against the American submarine campaign. We have lost this phase of the war. Our only hope is that the Americans will shift their submarine forces to support invasion operations, reducing pressure on our shipping lanes. Hirohito's response was not recorded in official minutes, but witnesses later reported that the Emperor sat in silence for several minutes before dismissing the briefing. Japan's leaders understood that the war was lost, though fighting would continue for another 18 brutal months. The American submarine campaign continued accelerating through 1944. New fleet submarines joined the Pacific Force every month. Advanced radar systems provided detection ranges exceeding 20 miles. Improved torpedoes carried larger warheads and ran more reliably. Most importantly, ultra-intelligence continued providing precise information about Japanese convoy routes, allowing submarines to ambush convoys with devastating efficiency. Japanese merchant losses in 1944 would total over 3.8 million tons, exceeding total Japanese merchant construction since the Meiji era. The Empire's maritime lifeline was being severed completely. Individual submarine skippers achieved results that bordered on the incredible. Commander Richard O'Kane in USS Tang sank 24 Japanese ships totaling 93,000 tons in 5 patrols. Commander Eugene Fluckey in USS Barb sank 17 ships, and then, when merchant targets became scarce, began attacking trains and factories along the Japanese coast with his deck gun. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder sank 16 Japanese destroyers and escorts, crippling Japan's anti-submarine forces. These men were not superhuman. They were products of intensive training, equipped with superior technology, supported by excellent intelligence, and motivated by total commitment to destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. The final accounting of the American submarine campaign reveals achievement that staggers comprehension when compared to the Japanese estimate of January 1942. Japanese analysts had predicted 4 to 5 years would pass before American submarines posed a significant threat. The actual timeline was 18 months from effective weapons to dominant force and 36 months from war's beginning to near total destruction of Japan's merchant fleet. 288 American fleet submarines, a force that never exceeded 16,000 personnel at sea simultaneously, sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. They killed an estimated 97,000 Japanese soldiers in transport sinkings, more combat deaths than American forces inflicted in many major island campaigns. They strangled Japan's war economy, isolated its garrisons, and demonstrated that economic warfare systematically applied could achieve strategic victory without invasion. The human cost of this achievement fell heavily on both sides. 52 American submarines were lost during the Pacific War, with 3,506 submariners killed, a casualty rate of 22%, the highest of any American service branch. These men fought an invisible war beneath the waves, enduring depth charge attacks, mechanical failures, and the constant psychological pressure of operating in an environment where any mistake meant death for the entire crew. They received little public recognition during the war because their operations remained classified. When they died in darkness and silence, their submarines becoming steel coffins on the ocean floor. For Japanese sailors and soldiers who faced American submarines, The experience created trauma that endured for decades. Survivors reported nightmares 50 years after the war ended, dreams of torpedoes striking hulls, of water rushing into darkened compartments, of screaming men trapped as ships capsized. The fear was not of dying honorably in combat, but of dying helplessly, unable to fight back against an enemy they could not see or touch. This psychological wound cut deeper than physical injuries, because it violated every principle of warrior culture that Japanese military tradition celebrated. There was no honor in drowning in darkness, while the enemy escaped untouched. The strategic implications of the submarine campaign extended far beyond World War II. American success in commerce destruction established submarine warfare as the dominant form of naval economic warfare. Every major navy developed submarine forces modeled on American Pacific operations. Nuclear propulsion eventually eliminated the need to surface, creating true submarines rather than submersible torpedo boats. Modern naval doctrine assumes that in any future conflict, submarines will attempt to sever enemy maritime supply lines exactly as American submarines did against Japan. The lessons learned in the Pacific between 1941 and 1945 remain fundamental to naval strategy worldwide. For Japan, the submarine campaign produced national trauma that influenced post-war development in unexpected ways. The Maritime Self-Defense Force placed enormous emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, developing world-leading sonar technology and anti-submarine tactics. Japanese shipbuilding industry, rebuilt after the war, became the world's largest, a response to the memory of losing 8.8 million tons of shipping. The psychological scars of submarine warfare influenced an entire generation of Japanese naval officers who dedicated their careers to ensuring such vulnerability would never exist again. In 1995, a memorial ceremony in Tokyo honored Japanese merchant mariners who died during World War II. Among the speakers was Commander Hideaki Yoshimura, retired, who had survived the sinking of transport Miyasan Maru in November 1944. He was 19 years old when American torpedoes struck his ship. He spent 18 hours in the water before rescue. Of 4,500 men aboard, fewer than 700 survived. Yoshimura spoke quietly, his voice barely audible to those in attendance. We sailed into waters where death waited invisibly. We knew the submarines were there. We knew they would attack. But duty required us to sail anyway. Most of my comrades died in darkness, trapped in sinking ships, drowning without seeing the enemy who killed them. I survived by chance, nothing more. For 70 years, I have asked myself why I lived when so many died. I have no answer. I can only remember them and tell their story so they are not forgotten. The memorial wall behind Yoshimura listed 60,000 names of Japanese merchant mariners killed during the war. The wall represented only documented deaths. Thousands more died whose names were never recorded, lost in ships that sank so quickly and completely that casualty lists could never be compiled. Each name represented a life ended violently in the darkness beneath the Pacific. A family that received notification of death without any remains to bury. A future erased by the silent war beneath the waves. The wall stands as testament not to the glory of naval warfare but to its terrible cost, measured in human lives destroyed by machines and strategies that turned the ocean into a killing field. The Imperial Japanese Navy's estimate that American submarines would require 4 to 5 years to become effective proved catastrophically wrong because it underestimated American determination, industrial capacity, and adaptability. Japanese planners assumed peacetime training and development timelines would apply during war. They failed to understand that the United States would compress years of development into months through desperate innovation and total resource commitment. They assumed technical problems with torpedoes would delay the submarine campaign indefinitely. They did not anticipate that submarine commanders would solve these problems themselves through unauthorized testing and direct defiance of bureaucratic authority. Most critically, they assumed American submarines would follow traditional doctrine and target warships. They never imagined the United States would wage unrestricted economic warfare with the goal of destroying not just Japan's navy, but its entire capacity to sustain military operations. This miscalculation cost Japan the war as surely as any battlefield defeat. The submarines did not win the Pacific War alone, but they created the conditions that made American victory inevitable. They isolated Japanese garrisons, making island-hopping campaigns feasible. They strangled Japan's oil supply, grounding aircraft and immobilizing warships. They sank the merchant fleet that would have supplied and reinforced defensive positions. They killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who never reached the battlefields where they were desperately needed. They accomplished all this with a force that represented less than 2% of the United States Navy's tonnage, demonstrating that properly applied technology and strategy could overcome vast numerical disparities. The story of how 288 American submarines sank 1,300 Japanese ships in 36 months, instead of the projected 48 to 60 months, stands as one of history's most complete strategic victories. It also stands as a warning about the consequences of underestimating an enemy's capacity for innovation and determination. Japanese planners who confidently predicted years of safety from submarine attack made assumptions based on peacetime logic that evaporated in the crucible of total war. The Americans they dismissed as requiring years of preparation compressed that timeline through sheer force of will, industrial power, and the courage of submariners who sailed into danger knowing that 1 in 4 would never return. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.